this is going to seem rather confusing and intuitively out of order. That's because from our perspective it pretty much is. So this idea is basically as a result of the combination of all the technologies that I've described previously, the ability to access superconscious states, to create temporal distortion fields and bend perception of time, to change the rate of experience, to alter DNA to incorporate more experience within an accelerated temporal moment or rate of experience at a time, if you will, to increase the rate of increasing the rate of experience, or maybe increase the bandwidth of the rate of increasing the rate of experience, so that a fundamental shift occurs, an exponential modulation in the perception, or at least the experience of the universe, and as well, through that, the experience of the self in the universe. The two interplay and the two change. To change the experience or perception of the self is to change the experience or perception of the universe, and so there is an interplay. And the DNA is the key to unlocking that potential of consciousness which surpasses the limits of biological consciousness, because the function of DNA surpasses the singularity of biological consciousness and connects individuals and selves across space and time. That is the fundamental property of DNA. And so all of these capacities basically amounted to the person moving forward to or becoming the end result of what time, consciousness, and experience would ultimately bring about as far as what they would become. So then, what this is in reference to, the easiest way to understand this is to look at the concept of the long body in, I believe, Tibetan Buddhism, and it's also, India has their own version, and really all of them do. You have the long body, which is the elongated, extra-dimensional version of the self throughout time, and the description is that the body is actually an undulated, rather snake-like form, stretching from the small embodiment, if you will, of the fetus into the child that expands and grows into adulthood, with all moments interconnected as one continuous stream, like a body of a snake, and then shrinking down through the decay of old age into death and essentially decaying and disappearing. Ultimately, we're connected to the entirety of experience, and so within the DNA, within the electrical impulses of the brain, is contained the information of the long body, meaning all of the experiences of time throughout, before, and after what we have experienced presently. So then, with this perspective, the information, the encoded information, the possibilities of what can happen could be accessible through the DNA, through the literal electromagnetic structure of the soul, as a kind of tucked away or wrapped up higher dimensional aspect of the very information and embodiment we experience in the present. So through the advanced technology, these Teslian wave generator systems, that layer of higher dimensionally folded information is unfolded and brought into experience in one complete moment, one complete observation or act of awareness. And so that brings one into the viewpoint of what is called the long body, but it also removes them from any particular place in the present, and therefore the person becomes an extra-dimensional, their experience moves into an extra-dimensional perspective of consciousness, but they move out of the view of the present, but in that same way, what a person experiences from that perspective is what encodes the present for each moment all throughout time. And so the people brought into this state perceived the influencing of their past selves from the future perspective that they attained from that superconscious state, and this can be described through technology and acceleration as well as through spiritual practice, which is a slightly different process with the same results in a different manner though. And so then another way of looking at the superconsciousness that relates to basically jumping to the future perspective is that the brain naturally has the subconsciousness, and the majority of memory is held in the subconscious, where the memory of the childhood associations, fears, attractions or developments, all of that, and then the middle age or adolescent modern memory, where there is learned skills and abilities and muscle memory and things like that, and then a short-term memory area which is conscious, and we're conscious of the short-term memory coming in through the five senses, which only lasts a few seconds, because as soon as somebody says a stream of information to you, you have a few seconds to understand it, but if you don't perceive what was said then, it goes away after a few seconds. And everyone has experienced this. If somebody says their name and, for 3 or 4 seconds they don't respond, and all of a sudden something clicks on and they hear it, because that remained, it flashed in that memory for a few seconds. And this is called echoic memory. The idea is, if you can reverse that, the electromagnetic flux, the order of that, and your primary awareness moves into the long-term subconscious memory, while your unconscious at that point becomes the short-term memory, then you become aware of the expanse, the long body of time, basically like time traveling, but you lose the focus, you defocus from the present moment. That's basically going into a dream state or a trance state, or one of these experiences where you're kind of off in your mind, and you can go anywhere in time at that point, because your mind basically picks where you want to go and brings you there. And this is the technological process of literally inverting the short-term memory and the long-term memory, so that the temporal orientation in time is literally inverted. The time cone is literally flipped inside out, or upside down, however you want to look at that. And the experience is, it changes the perspective, if you will, of the universe. The entire universe at once is basically flipping the self inside out, more or less. But one can do this while remaining in the body, and the personality kind of becomes a kind of transcendental, if you will, a kind of imaginative, subjective experience that goes beyond the conscious perception of the limitations of experience, which basically means there's a lot of more or less uncertainty about which events are real and which events are of the mind alone. And it's literally, maybe to define it more with more clarity, it's as if one goes from one time stream, one consciously, physically defined, manifested reality, into witnessing, or maybe even being, all the surrounding time streams looking in, and having all that background information in the forefront of your reality. Whereas if you could think hard enough, you could break it all down to one stream. Just like now, if we think hard enough, we can expand and see what's out there around us. So inverting it kind of twists that interplay around. And the real question here, the kicker, is which one is the real way of viewing reality? It may be that they're equally as relative. Another way to put that is that from that perspective, all experiences may be of the mind, and the whole lot of them may be literally contained within a kind of mental environment where everything we experience in this world is actually contained within. We perceive consciously that it is the other way, that we, and our mind, is in this world. But once you feel that inversion, which happens sooner or later, one method or another, key might be to doing it now to the degree where we're prepared for it, and we have a little bit of that inversion before the full inversion, and that way we're never fully inverted, but always in a fluctuation of both as one. But the idea is that it may be perceived then that the world is within our mind. But then again, if there really is no true way to look at it, it might be best to have the perception of both at all times by navigating across the realms, making the journey from one up the vortex to the other, so that while we're conscious in the body, alive and awake, we have the perception of the all. And while we're in the world of the perception of the all, we can also, at that point, learn to recreate the waking consciousness, the self-awareness of the physical body, and essentially exist forever in eternity. This all comes down to the true identity as far as the awareness of the self, and how we are going to integrate or form or maybe angle our perspective as far as one reality as the dominant or the other. Imagine if we handle that as if we know we handle it with the belief that we're in the middle, we're neutral, they could be either or, then that perspective will be angled in that harmonic, geometrically balanced manner, and everything from there splays out into our personal history, our cosmic psychology in that format, to the point where we are then created half and half in both worlds, and we don't get stuck in the cycle of one and the other in that continual flip-flop. And so we're in a unique position in history now where we have the opportunities to experience this and know about this by building knowledge off of the previous ages and using technology and spiritual practices to our advantage to make this understanding, to know this and realize this and live that way, so that we can basically we can make ourselves more or less eternal in that sense. The interesting part is that we really don't need to rely on anyone else. You don't have to go to somebody and pay them for this. You don't have to go somewhere and, repeat this over and over again. You only need to repeat the ideas that allow you to comprehend how these perceptual illusions construct reality in order to deconstruct them essentially in reverse, painting, if you will, blindfolded maybe, or walking backwards towards the source, which is more or less reversed as if we're in a kind of reflection when viewed from the conscious mind, and a projection in the same sense that sources from the unconscious, and it's actually sourced from either end, because whatever end we're on, the projection source is seemingly on the other end. And so it's a continuous illusion until we create the source consciously, knowingly, on the end we're on, by making that journey and completing it. And the only way we can do that is by coming into awareness of this whole system, the whole construct, basically, of how this all works. You couldn't basically accidentally do it. It does sometimes happen spontaneously to people, but even then, if it happens, then the person knew, they just didn't know and didn't fit into society where they could say, this is what I'm about to do, watch me wake up my, super conscious self. They just did it automatically because that's what they were good at, basically. So the idea is that it's hidden behind the knowing of the illusion of the identity in the self and the limitations of reality as one or the other, with the mind in the environment or the environment in the mind. And so this is a very linear and direct way of understanding this, which is that all the stimuli, the energetic input that is received by the body and used by the brain and the sensory systems to generate, or is used by the perceptual systems to generate perception, which becomes the virtual construct of our reality, these impulses are inextricably linked to the body that we receive them or perceive them through, and the world where the energy is basically received from or sent from. So our experience of the self as the physical body is inextricably linked with that energy of the world, the information of the environment. And in the same way, we then get an array of information that we generate a hierarchy of order, which usually or always has a gradient of some type of centralized order from high to low or inner to outer or vice versa. And in that, we try to integrate we try to put our identity on one of those layers, or we find our identity there, and then we try to navigate to higher and higher order. Ultimately, we automatically begin to achieve the pinnacle of that order, which is at the very top. This is just like a pyramid where you have the wider, more expanse functions of priorities at the bottom, and these must synchronize and organize towards one single motivating priority of the self, the generation of self-awareness, the organization of that one concept, and each layer successively goes progressively from one to the next and must be held and maintained on the lower layers as each higher layer is achieved in unison, in a harmonization across the whole. And if this is achieved entirely, then at the highest layer there is a unified, centralized point where that focus is equally, inextricably linked to all other layers simultaneously, and that is through the organization of the information of each other lower layer towards one single collective, if you will, for that one being, principle of self-awareness that is resoundingly present throughout the whole. And so that takes effort, that takes energy to do. It takes focus. And ultimately, it's just self-awareness. And notice how it takes energy and self-awareness, but the result is that we literally become a being completed in the sense of a kind of cosmic fulfillment of their own awareness through the lower physical layers of their being and their biological physical consciousness, and all the other layers all the way up to the layers we basically cannot see, because at the top of the pyramid there's such a finite, infinitesimally small point, like a 0 point kind of, that is beyond perception. It is the image, the universal quality of exaction. And so that draws us all the way together to a central point, which is beyond the grasp of the lowest layers, yet as we reach it and achieve it, all becomes known, all becomes aligned, and ultimately all the layers have kind of become one at a different degree of diffraction, if you will. Yet another way of elaborating on this is that the primary model for reality becomes a probability matrix of multiple or multitudes of time streams, and through this, the definitive outline of the self and the experience, the edges essentially become blurry and transient, and they become a kind of diffuse potential, whereas the individual is merged with the decisions that are immediately surrounding the decisions that they did make, and the lines basically become blurred between what has happened and what might have happened. Very confusing, but ultimately we're connected to a plethora of possibilities, and the only reason we have just one in our experience, consciousness, now, is because of this interplay between short-term memory and long-term memory in the conscious and subconscious mind, and the reality is that we are both. We're not just the conscious or just the subconscious, we're both. And so the lines between what is and what isn't is so far beyond what we can attain in a single waking, consciousness experience, that it makes it basically look like a dream or a kind of endless array of experiences that meld and merge into one another, crossing the threshold of what we perceive as our conscious definition of who we are based upon our memories and our experiences and our choices. In a final elaboration, basically as well, we begin to merge or blur the boundaries between the conscious self and the non-self, being the environment, the principles that motivate us, the other people in our life, our experience. We become everything that works to support the definition of the conscious mind as well as the conscious mind itself. So we become the foreground as well as the background. It's the same thing, like a magic eye image where they kind of, you cross your eyes and pull an image embedded into the background into the foreground, and they switch, and you have this superimposed hyper depth perceptual experience, basically imagery. Okay, so imagine that happens and you gain the appearance, the awareness of this superimposed version of the self imposed in the conscious mind and in the subconscious background of all experiences. That illusion of that magic eye image is literally the superconscious self that extends across experiences, boundaries of space and time, and the definition of the personal identity. So in a way, a person literally jumped in experience, in consciousness, in the ability to relate to the universe and comprehend the self. It jumped far beyond all the parameters, and like I said previously, perception of consciousness in the self is intrinsically linked through the DNA to the stimulus, or the stimuli, and the particular specific time, if you will, stamped, or time relative variables of a given situation, realm, or time period in history. So when one opens up and incorporates through this transdimensional ability or capacity of the DNA, knowledge or experience, or even information, raw data of another time or place, then that person's definitions, the perceptual limits of the self, become altered, fundamentally altered into something far beyond what was present previously. If this happens in a proportional, geometrically sound, harmonious, balanced manner, then it's like taking a shape and proportionally expanding it. The overall shape, the overall alignment is not distorted. You just have a bigger or smaller version. And if you have one of these quote-unquote magical shapes or geometrical alignments, maybe like a Buckminster ball, when it expands, it incorporates a function that introduces a changing of the variables of the alignments of each of the alignments of the intricate geometries of the shape or device or whatever. So when this happens properly, there's an expansion. This expansion does not degrade the information into a distortion and an overall distorted product or result. And as well, the information, the experience, the amount of information and experience that can be transferred exponentially increases. It doubles, and then the rate of doubling doubles, and then that rate doubles. And that's a triple or a quadruple compared to what it was initially. And this happens continuously until you must incorporate a new format or medium, a new realm that contains an extra amount of space, basically an extra dimension, in order to fully or completely incorporate all the information that can be expressed. So, in other words, when that amount of information within an individual's experience expands, and this happens proportionally, and the information exponentially increases, then that information increase moves beyond what this very realm can even contain. The limits, the physical, electrical, dimensional limits of the transfer and expression of variability, information dimensional contrast becomes surpassed. That is the unfolding of DNA, if you will, into a form that relates more to the quote-unquote original presence or environment, and in this way the person's experience, their reality, their consciousness even, more or less turns inside out, kind of like one of those four-dimensional or higher dimensional holographic moving images of these shapes, or like a hypercube that moves and expands outward and then begins again in the center. And that's not an exaction.
Imagine the hypercube is code or programmed movements taking place as it is in the computer, and so then for the three-dimensionally defying or three-dimensional defying motion of simultaneous internal-external movement to take place, then the code of the three-dimensional layer must have a secondary or an extra layer, basically an extra dimensional layer that exists outside the third-dimensional parameters, meaning it's capable of processing information that the third-dimensional parameters cannot, that layer of code, and it's partially or momentarily operated through and within so that the three-dimensionally defined parameters can jump, quote-unquote, inside out while seemingly defying those three-dimensional space boundaries or rules. And so this is simply an expression of a three-dimensional limit of functions being partially expressed within the fourth dimension, or the entire three-dimensional program running within the larger four-dimensional surrounding, enabling this jumping across the 3D boundaries, which is simply like breaking or going farther than the original 3D code permits without such interaction. If we're all within, each lower layer is within a larger segment or a larger parameter set, larger code, then that explains how space within and objects within can operate in a way that defies the perceived limits of this space or universe. And in that way, they're literally momentarily operating on the external or extra-dimensionally included code, the parameters of which are not confined by the same limits or value limits by the three-dimensional code below it.
The idea is it moves so far that it surpasses the boundaries of the realm and must inherently open up into a new domain. And so that is literally the experience of an individual moving from the one domain where all of this is physically mapped in linear, three-dimensionally defined parameters into one where those parameters are exponentially multiplied at every degree where there is a potential for those parameters, which means it's an entirely new realm. Motion in one way is simultaneously motion in 1, 2, 3, or 4 different ways at once. Every motion then is an expansion, and every contraction then is a production. The fundamental faculties, the occurrences and the operation and function of awareness at that point becomes something entirely different, in the sense that it's beyond what it is previously through physical consciousness. And as well, it doesn't change parallel to a different dream or a side reality. It changes to the over reality, that this reality is just a single page of, a single angle or perspective of. It changes to the expanded reality, that this one sits within dimensionally in a proportional equilibrium of containment that produces the possibilities that we experience that do not go outside of those predetermined limitations of experience. So imagine if you isolate and convert or treat the variables of those experiences here, the parameters, and in that way seek to turn them over, if you will. Basically, on the other side of what this is, every experience is fundamentally based upon that. It would be like saying, here we have individual moments of a life. There we have individual lives of a higher organization of multiple streams of life. So it's expanded. It's not just a parallel. It's everything that this is when you get all the things that this is an experience, and every single unit above, or however you want to look at it, is what the entirety of every unit down here is, all at once. And that happens by incorporating an expansion, pretty much just like a buckyball, where the variables, the alignments, the geometric alignments expand. They expand proportionally, and the change, the rate of expansion, as well as the variability of alignment, incorporates new information in a geometrically proportional manner that creates multiples or multitudes of new versions of the original shape, the original defined object, the original information in the end result. Same thing basically happens for a baby or a child to become an adult, as everything expands and multiplies. Just imagine then the single human life, the baby life, or the human, the adult, in that way, the cosmic baby, expands and multiplies on every dimension, every angle, every perspective, every direction, every feature, every factor, every variable, every conscious facet is amplified by that change equally. Then what you end up with is a cosmic adult being, which is the expanded, dimensionally larger, or a higher dimensional version of the original unit of experience or shape or object or whatever it is, basically a body of information. So the point of that is that when the individual encodes their life with the information that is proportional relative to relative to itself, then when that point of contact occurs where there is a transition into a higher dimensional expansion, then because that individual programmed their existence through the incorporation of proportionally relative, or in other words harmonized values, to create an existence or a buckyball or a geometric shape, that then when that amplifier is reached or applied to it, and it expands, and each variable rotates, and each line draws out, and each corner or nodal point of that geometric shape, kind of like a mandala, then when each one of those opens up into its own mandala, if they're imbalanced, you're either going to get a really sloppy looking snowflake that doesn't really carry the original message, or you're going to get one that carries the same message multiplied and expanded to the point of containing an exponential amount of information that was present in the previous. I think that kind of outlines it fairly descriptively and fairly easily to make sense of. It's simply an expansion of what was already there, but in order to have that cooked, alchemically processed result equate and recognize or be recognizable to the original, then the information must be coded equivalently so that the overall result is harmonized within itself and within itself to the original, and you have a transdimensional correspondence, a transliteration between the end result, each part of it and it's into itself, the original product, and each part of it into itself. You have this interdimensional, transdimensional, higher and lower dimensional intervortex type geometry of relation to one another, and it's just like a dimensional mirror. It's just as if you applied an algorithm that said magnify and expand and then reflect each facet of this to a certain degree and come out with a new original result.
One could also say that instead of coming out with something new, one's basically returning to the original blueprint, which is present before the whole journey begins, and is basically an expansion contraction back into what was previous before, and when there is no distortion present, that is where there's basically a return to wholeness. But as well, nothing repeats, it's always genuine or original, and so the pattern is different, but the experience is new, which is pretty much paradoxical for the physical way of looking at things and viewing time and existence, whereas if there was a continuously repeating cycle in linear time, eventually we would have to begin to repeat the same information because we can't comprehend, at least not physically through biological consciousness, an eternal sense of originality. However, in the sense of where our consciousness comes from, and that would be a higher level, people call the soul blueprint, or what is likened to pure awareness. To that, the concept would be corresponding because that is a non-physical nature, and so the same boundaries don't apply.
So again, the focus here is on maintaining equilibrium and maintaining the function of the behavior of consciousness to generate emotion and experience that fundamentally relates to the end result, instead of having something that doesn't make sense in comparison to the original, which would be like baking a cake and ending up with like upside down mud brownies or something like that. That doesn't make sense. Something that's close but not quite.
And this is something on a website. I have the link in the picture right there. It pretty much describes everything that I've been more or less trying to describe here with these videos, and specifically in this one, but as well in others. And the text on the website reads underneath the heading, the point, which is the center of that, whatever you want to call that. And so at the center of a circle or a sphere is always an infinitesimal point. The point needs no dimension, yet embraces all dimension. Transcendence of the illusions of time and space result in the point of here and now, which is basically like the point of the cone, the focal point between past and future, which I've described in a few written posts, and I might have briefly mentioned in a video. And so then that's the most primal light of consciousness. And so then at the end it says, if our essence is truly spiritual omnipresence, then perhaps the point of our being here is to recognize the oneness we share, validating all individuals as equally precious and sacred aspects of that one. And so this pretty much encapsulates what I mean, or what I refer to, in the sense that we live in reference to the overall emotional function of consciousness or being to the whole. Meaning, if that's the truth of the whole, then how, that we will come into a full awareness of some other time, some other plane, some other place, after death, whatever you want to call it. That means that the only way to actually reach that, and if we all already, are destined to reach it, then the only way to actually remain who we are now, in other words, to exist in that state more or less eternally, because once you pass through death, that destroys us physically, then what else would stop you? And so then the only way to do that is to live in respect of that knowledge that's forthcoming then in the now, and to know each other and one another, and to live in respect of that, and to live in the correspondence of these layers, basically. So the point of self basically is no self, or no definition or contrast to any other. As soon as you get into contrasting one or another, that's moving out of that central point onto that outer edge of the disk or the sphere, and at that point it's differentiating, and the differentiating self is not the core, the source that is actually what all the selves and the views are coming from. And so the true self is no self, but simultaneously all selves, and that is the paradox. But you can see this in action through the imagery that is displayed, and there are terms for it as well. And I touch on that in the previous video, the kind of summary video I gave to this one, and this one's kind of stretched on and on and on. I'll have to take this information and repeat it in a much more clarified recording, as well as a more clarified presentation as well. And it does mention something about the light at the end of the tunnel and what that could refer to, and I'm about to speak about that in the video. Before that, to talk a little bit about what the nature of the geometries are really indicating, or why they are there, is basically that you have space, if you want to call it empty space, and then you have all the possible shapes, motions, arrangements, relations, interconnections, or connections that are within that. And so in somewhere within that, if you can draw all the possible spaces and motions, geometries, if you were to define your awareness, your consciousness, and they're two different things. If you've been, listening to my stuff, consciousness is more biological, and awareness doesn't really have that counterpart. And so, if you're going to describe that as an actual presence, which if you're experiencing it, then it has a presence. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. And so then you have to use that space in some way, these geometries, these shapes, in order to to explain or depict that motion or those changes. And so what we end up with basically is universe-size spaces and geometries, because the non-physical aspect of these electromagnetic waves or the more refined waves, they don't basically take up space. They are measurements of charge basically in perspective, and so it's as if you're instantly dealing with or simultaneously dealing with maximum amount of space and infinitely small or infinitesimal tight, pointed cones and vortices and 0-point fractal spaces. And so to get a flux between the two, that's where these geometries come into play. It is the way of merging from linear physical space into more not infinite but more extremely expanse and extremely tiny spaces. The geometry is the way the two merge, and that is the way that those spaces, those energy or experience, awareness is expressed and basically present in a physical universe. And so now I continue in talking about what I'm going to lead into basically the light trap and this soul recycling and the mind control of how basically the system can be used to get people to recreate the same thing over and over, which never exists in nature.
And that's where we have mass mind control programming, because if people can be led towards creating the mental, emotional, and physical patterns of experience that are encoded electromagnetically into their awareness, then when that shift occurs, they become that end result, basically a higher dimensional counterpart species that reflects the intentions of the programmers. That's why self-awareness is the key here, it's the hinge, it's the guide, and that's why this can't be done without the permission and self-awareness of an individual. However, this also means that if people unknowingly give their self-awareness away and their right to choose, then the results are still the same. And so somebody could take this process that can't be changed without the application of free will. They can abuse that, and this is done through the use of psychological manipulation of the conscious mind, the biological consciousness, the personality. And this is related to the incorporation of a mind control system, as well as genetic modifications, if you will, that basically lower the guard, the natural resistance to such changes from or within the human race. It domesticates people in order to use them as a seed platform to create these higher dimensional races through the hijacking of their encoding transceiver signal processing system, whereby their free will is used to create the intentions, unwittingly or not, and carry out the emotions, thoughts, actions, behavior of a programmed system designed by the programmers to create an end result that suits the desires and the needs of the programmer. And so what is then a spiritual discovery system becomes literally like an industrial factory processing plant that uses people as a kind of commercial asset to be traded and sold like commodities in the higher realms, you could say, through the generation of higher consciousness, through the end results of what people naturally, energetically evolve into when they come to a kind of whole mind-body realm activation, critical acceleration of awareness, whereby the rate of acceleration of change of self-awareness and progress, which then feeds back into the changing of oneself, which feeds back into the awareness, which feeds back in, and this runaway cycle is achieved, and you get a spontaneous spiritual evolution, basically.
And so another way to look at this is that the pattern in moving from one layer to the next is to create a continuous organization, a hierarchy, or a correspondence. But the issue is if the pattern repeats, if like this image here, this movie, I guess a GIF, if it's like that, and the one layer enlarges to the next layer, but there's really no difference between them, then you have an endless loop, a repeating pattern, and that's literally called what is known as the holographic fractal infection. That takes the overall picture, which this is basically the Buddha brought, some people call it. It's a type of Mandelbrot, basically, which relates to the whole. The idea is if you have the fractal, you have the nature of existence, but you have to have the beginning and the end. If you don't have those, and you're just somewhere endlessly in the middle, that's literally what is known as a kind of spiritual or cosmic death spiral for the soul. It drains the soul's energy for the time that it spends in this system, because time at that point is relative, and so it's the degree of the individual to navigate out of that system, where the alternative is basically merging with the background energy, the background information, and becoming absorbed into that system without actually making it out. And the strange part here is basically that, one, it's not the physical alignment of the energy around the body that enables one to reach realization. It is the conceptual alignment of what could be thought of as an invisible form of energy, or maybe an invisible realm, or an energy within an invisible realm too small to measure or see externally. And so the body is related to the illusory holofractal trap of energy, which translates into higher or lower repeating fractal realms that don't actually have the entry or exit points towards that supreme level of realization where you can basically zoom out all the way and say, here's the whole picture, it's all there, it's all realized. And the way that works is through self-observation. And so the organization of the invisible energy of the soul is the alignment of the tree, the original full tree, not the partial tree, which is actually used as part of these Metatronic soul-stealing grids. And this creates the function of enabling the self-observed universal blueprint for reality within the self, with the self, as the observer, the center, or more so the observer aspect, and thus as the center of that universe, because the universe is formed out of the act of observation. So when you observe your act of observing, you create that self-observation feedback loop that creates the universe with the you as the center, as the core. And so then that moves all the layers, inner and outer, into an alignment so that there is a harmonization, and thus there are clear pathways or channels which point towards the entrance and exit of the realm, which are concepts used to orient and align oneself in a larger reality. The ego, duality, are two ways of entrapping the self into a repeating cycle of mirrored reflections which continue like an endless cube, which is where the cube comes from. And here's the kicker that I was basically in the process of describing earlier. Those who don't figure it out in time go nowhere, ever. They're absorbed into the system itself. Those who never left because they went nowhere never came in the first place, and always were part of the background processing of the system itself. So those that don't finalize this realization are literally, and were always literally, a part of this system in itself, and never were individuated, basically soul beings who came into the system. And I don't really say that to worry anybody, but that is the basis of some of this information. And so here's a brief excerpt, which is pretty much a summary of this video, or at least that section of the information, which is from a post I wrote earlier today. So the primary layers of the wholeness of the higher dimensional geometries, meaning the larger picture, the key values, principles of the soul, awareness, the structure, the underlying structure of the whole array of all that other bendy, twisty, spirally stuff, okay? Basically every little facet of the fractal. The whole one zoomed out, you have a series of fundamental layers. Those fundamental layers are the principles of the soul. They don't change no matter where you go, who you see, what happens, it's all the same. It's like a body. You have hands and eyes, okay? There's the same repeating pattern there. That's the core of it. And so figuring out those and acknowledging those primary layers are the key to resolving the holographic fractal infection paradox of the universe, of this universe. Instead of looping endlessly from one fractal layer to another, one must recreate the entire image within themselves and then place themselves within that image. This is how one orients within the larger universe and escapes the endless repeating labyrinth of the fractal holographic construct, which has been programmed into this reality via the brainwaves, the DNA, and the scalar waves generated by these powerful underground and atmospheric devices. Through this, the center of the universe centers around you, the observer and the generator of the parameters. By placing awareness on anything else conceptually, we are literally the donkey with the carrot on the stick chasing the truth of reason, which will always extend itself one more measure of experience away the more we move outward in attempting to attain it, kind of like the days continuing. This is because the universe is generated out of your observation, therefore the center is centered around your center of observation, and when you place yourself in the center, you then harmonize all the differing and contrasting layers around you into a unified field with a clearly observable entry point, exit, beginning, and end. All of these are just concepts to be utilized for the alignment and orientation of one's self within the larger system. Each cycle becomes organized relative to itself and the larger cycle, and there is harmony between the layers. Without that, it's just like a series of entanglements or mazes, or a maze with no beginning or end, no ultimate higher or lower order. And that is the holographic fractal, however you want to say it, Metatronic soul recycling grid that they've developed and convinced us to operate on, wittingly or not, to literally continue this process over and over again, and like that circle spinning to become another circle and it repeats, that's a body becoming a body becoming a body endlessly. instead of simply going on to the higher, larger picture. The answer then is to basically not get stuck doing the same stuff over and over again, to be creative and continue on the overall journey from start to finish without delay. And that overall journey is in reference to the unveiling of the soul and the realization of the self as a cosmic being. And this sounds simple and straightforward, but that is where these control systems come into play, attempting to force people into these fractal repeating loops of reality through introducing these confines of identity and behavior, Hegelian dialectics of right and wrong, which all goes against the natural growth pattern of the soul and the original whole cosmic being. Thus, the civilization of today is anti-existence and pro-automation and hybridization of the individual with the collective, and the collective with the inorganic, not the living but the dead, background space and matter, literally attempting to convert people into the background processing energy of this holographic fractal universe, which also brings into light the concept that these controllers, agents, and operatives of the dark are essentially the dead space of the void brought into physical manifest into a body, and motivated and aligned with suppressing the natural growth pattern of humanity, the destiny to move beyond the confines of the false reality. And that is essentially how to maintain one's presence here. It's as if everything's shrinking, well, you have to continue to expand, or say everything's expanding and diffusing and diluting, well, you have to keep compressing and retaining your alignment and charge and self and all that. And so that's how to maintain in such a system. The complete answer is basically the escape plan, the exit plan, which is to gauge the amount of proportions that are possible within the scope, the looking glass that we have access to, and use our awareness to expand beyond the scope. And that way we can align ourselves larger, or in a sense, overreaching the limited continued layers of proportions between the harmonics and the dimensions, which I show and explain, and in a way to overcome the limited sense of how many layers we have access to, so that we can actually reach a maximal amount of proportions in between one another that goes beyond what the system can produce for us, using its kind of a phi mathematics and Euclidean, basically, geometry. And these are fractured, they're broken geometries, because we can create, or we can achieve, an awareness that goes beyond the limitations of what is essentially a geometric fractal infinity, a hyperbolic infinity, where it goes from one layer and that shrinks down into an infinitesimally small point, and then next and next and next, and so you have a layer inward with the extremely small diameter that goes into a point, and you have as many layers within that horizontally as you can get. And if you were to draw that then lengthwise, as if that was a circle spiral going in, you have an infinitely long version of dimensions, proportions going lengthwise as well. And you maximize the amount that can be held within that scope, within the universal geometry. And so then once you can do that and move beyond it, the universe basically can't hold your awareness anymore. And so another way to explain it is that you say you're within a holofractal environment. It is through zooming out further and further and further, possibly after centering, and zooming out further and further, but holding the memory or the awareness, the focal point of the originating layer that you began, until you maintain enough focus between that starting point and the supposed end point that you can then superimpose or extrapolate through your awareness a point that goes beyond the confines of what is basically extrapolated from those points to keep you confined within another set of repeating layers. It's easier to use these visuals to understand it. But it's through holding the awareness of the original, the beginning, and moving into one where you basically max out the amount of proportions you can go to, which is basically a nature of the mathematics that we have access to here. If you zoom out so many times, eventually you'll get to, say, patterns of 3, 6, 9, 12, so on and so forth. But each one, when you get to a larger number, well, you can still collapse those back down into 3, 6, and 9, and so on and so forth. So once you gain a large enough amount and a large enough, say, momentum, you can expand beyond the number set that's extrapolated by the geometric system, basically the construct, and more or less overstep the boundary and use your awareness to basically put yourself in an environment that it can't basically follow or track or create you within, and it literally you navigate out. So this is the concept. The whole idea is basically the concept of Jacob's ladder. You have the base level here, the construct reality, and you have the completion cycle, which is reached beyond this realm or at the top, whatever. And it's seemingly never ending, but the idea is that the realm we're more or less kind of stuck within through perception, basically. It's a perceptual prison. Is seemingly never ending because it recreates itself with our perception. So as long as we're conscious of it, then by navigating out of it, using our perception and consciousness of it, it creates more of it. So that's not how it's done. And here are basically the Hyperboreans, you could call them, the ones from outside of the system that basically exist without it or outside of it. And so then you have the same depiction here, fairly similar concept. And they're more or less leading one another out. And then, oh, jumped ahead. Wow, that's really, okay, that's about it. So basically then, it's funny picture-in-picture concept. So these basically are the background beings. These are the ones belonging to the system. They more or less are a part of the system, merged with it, and they never leave. And their job is, from their point of view, more or less to keep everyone in. That's the whole point. That's their consciousness, that's their ability, and that's how it works for them. So then, that's not how that works. Okay, why is that happening? Excuse me. And so then, there's the same concept here. The dark beings, if you will, and then they're focusing on the goal, basically the true goal of realizing the completion of the pathway out, which is more or less the fractal recursive path, but not the infinitely repeating hollow fractal loop. That's the infection. That's the trick of keeping people here. The idea, there's one, I don't seem to have it now all of a sudden. Maybe I'll find it. Oh, there. So these are the commandments, basically. And that's the idea, that the pathway to heaven, the pathway out, the exit out is through harmony. That's all that really means, is that if you're harmonious, then your perceptual systems, the observational aspect of your coming to awareness of this universe will be centered, and like I previously presented with the toroid, that if it's centered, then you have the clear pathway up and down it, out. The line, okay, the direction of the ladder, the continuity of each rung is lined or organized by that harmony within, which you could call the commandments or whatever. And those are actually reversed because it wasn't what not to do, it was what to do. So that's a form of illusion in itself. But that literally kept the pathway straight by keeping your observational quality parameters, if you will, aligned to the point where the exit and entrance is visible. That's kind of the depiction of that, the meaning behind it, if you will, at least from what I've learned. So then the idea behind this is the stairway to heaven, and this is basically the idea of some of these projects, these societies, these group motions, if you will, to create an easier pathway out, to use technology, to use what we can, to use our power, our unity, to overcome the dark, and literally, but not overcome one or the other because that's the duality, but to become neutral to either, and neither one can see you at that point, you're invisible to them. And through that to make it a stairway, what's an intense climb, make it a little bit easier. And again, that could be an illusion because it might not ever be something that can be made easier. It's the disillusion of the false reality and paradigms, and so it's the death of the ego and, that type of stuff, and that's never easy. Although it can be easier, so I kind of didn't look at this stuff kind of like it was reasonable, kind of like a pipe dream, and also notice it's above the stars, meaning the stars are within this universe. So this is outside this universe, this area over here. And notice the color gradients as well, although it's a little bit reversed in color gradients, depending on the tint. A lot of these images have different tints. But now I see that that is the point. That's what they've been hinting at for a long time. That with self-empowerment and with unity working together, we can actually make it a little bit easier. It doesn't have to be difficult. There's, suffering has to be suffering, but everything doesn't have to be coated in a layer of suffering. Because I've seen both aspects of it, and it is a little bit easier when you have people there going, it's just an illusion, this isn't the end, it's not what you think at first. You can get through this, and it's way more comforting and easier than just being alone out somewhere and doing it on your own, although both experiences have their merit, and usually one has to do it alone before having that kind of help, because that's kind of how it works anyway. And so these are some of the meanings behind this, and that is kind of the depiction of Jacob's ladder. I'm going to try and explain this here. It's getting a little deep even for me, and not like I'm special, I'm just the one that's supposed to be explaining everything that I'm presenting. So the idea behind the fractals and the pathway is that it's not an endless repeating pattern. There is a wholeness and overall structure to the pattern, and this is found through the pattern recognition, basically. Noticing the ratio that each layer and layer is going to be using in order to go from layer to layer, and that way you're pretty much not waiting in perceptual, dimensional, proportional line for the end that will just continue to stretch and stretch and stretch, like the materialized version of Jacob's ladder, kind of like the electrical device generation phenomena thing. And the idea is that within these systems you have the proportions. The proportions are pretty much apparent, and you pretty much do this by noticing them as you go, as they develop. And so, for instance, say we're at layer 1, which is in that way the last layer, say 7 or something like that, or 4, 5, how many are in here? And so we're kind of on this level right here, and if we go and end up somewhere around, and we don't take in the whole map, remembering that we started here, we went to the next and the next and the next, we'll end up back on one of these and going back down again, and the whole cycle just repeats. It's like a spin cycle. So the idea is we start at one level, and then this expands, and so the ratio then is this diameter, to this diameter, and there's a specific number that will be up here that will be relative there to describe that. And so then from this one to the next, and from that one to the whole thing. And so as we're doing this as well, this would be basically how we're keeping the whole picture in mind. You would remember that this is the whole picture, what it looks like, because you know the pattern, you constructed it in your mind based upon where you are at any given layer. Then wherever you are in those, that labyrinth of layers, you know where you're at. You know how to get in or out, and that is basically the key. That's the key. It's the map key. And so the proportions now that's the phi ratio, which is fairly simple to look at. And so then you have, so that's the overarching ratio. Then they could all be connected and shrinking down layer by layer, but I didn't do that. I'm over to give you an idea of how it works better. So that is literally the phi ratio. Now, if you don't know that pattern, and those are literally number sets, that is literally these number sets. The golden ratio, all that stuff. That's literally a measurement of the trap system that we're in. That's what those ratios mean. Okay, that's the same ratio there. And notice how it mirrors. Mirroring, being able to mirror, is another way of how this is achieved. How you can project beyond what the one pattern you're in now is basically leading us to believe and going in circles, and we can add up that overall pattern. Just like we're going through fractal layer by fractal layer, but instead of zooming endlessly, we take a screenshot, if you will, of the first layer, then to the next and the next, and we compare them and see that there's a proportionality, a pattern, a progression from one to the next, and we measure that progression, and then we accelerate our awareness beyond the layers that are being extrapolated for us. It's similar to this, because this shows that they go endlessly and repeating, right? So that is the death spiral. That has no in or out. And the idea is, if you go from 1 to, say that's like a 1 to 2, and there's like 2 squares for every 1 square here, which is not, it's like 1, 3 something, or there's the ratios, the golden ratios in the phi, and then even the pi ratio, depending on what aspect you're measuring. And so then, those are proportions that lead in and out of the realm. and they depict how the realms will be organized in reference to one another and the overall whole. And the overall whole is beyond measurement, and that's the whole point. We have to get out of that measurement system in order to get to the truth, to reality. And so say it's a 1 to 2, and then, and it wouldn't be that, because they continue, the ratio stays the same, but their distances continue. I'm kind of not making sense here with the numbers, but the idea is, if it goes one number, say 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 into infinity, the idea is there's the difference between this and that, and that's its own number, just like if you're mapping out the Fibonacci and you add the differences between them and so on and so forth, and you get those number patterns, those magical patterns. Okay, the idea is then that it's not 1, 2, 3, 4 an infinite amount, it's the proportions of number, the value of proportional change between each layer, and those are the actual numbers then, which would look, something like that, where you get these are the differences, if you will. Instead of just one layer to the next, and it keeps going, there's a pattern here that's being displayed, and that pattern is one layer to the next, and is basically the answer to what's to come all the way down there, because then once you know the pattern, you don't count layer by layer by layer, you count one pattern to the next, and if you will, if you're going this way and that pattern's indicating there, eventually it opens up into different layers. I'm not explaining this properly because I need to create a whole new presentation for this. But the layers extend. Basically, imagine you're in the pattern set and you have the number ratios right here and they're all here. Okay, so how do you get to the face if you're in like a nose hair, or if you're in one of the cones and rods in the eye? Okay, the platform, if you will, for the construct of the numbers won't be there, but if the space is still the same, then how would you end up finding the pathway to the face? Imagine if you're just a molecule or an atom. If you didn't have the pattern, you could go endlessly, but if you know how to expand and then expand again, double that and triple that and continue, eventually you'll go and you'll end up with a face. When you do that in this inner cosmic version, you end up with the face of God, because you're looking at the entire cosmos. And some would say that's the construct creator, meaning he's the devil, he's the trickster. And so, but the idea is to zoom out enough and to make enough sense of the idea, the picture, that you're not counting one layer to the next, the next, the next, the next, the next, and it's continuous, but you get to the whole point, and you need to use the proportions to do that instead of just counting one layer, then the next layer, fractal layer, then the next, because that just creates an endless loop that continues to go. By paying attention and making note of the proportions, you can literally, as well, remembering the beginning layer, then you end up, that's where I was saying with the proportions here, I got tongue-tied, because if you remember the first layer that you began at, and you're zooming out, or however you're going to go, there's two various differing opinions, basically, of zooming in or out, or a simultaneous contraction and expansion, which I think is what it is, which gives you that fractal vortex that goes in and out simultaneously, and it basically overloads the processing of the universe. But if you remember the one you started at, okay, and then you go out and you have those proportions all lined up, and it's not just an infinite, endless numbers of 1 to 1,000, it's the number set of so then you have these number sets, and you can actually measure and mark one layer to the next, because you have a starting point. You see, you don't have that if you don't use the proportions. You just have, I'm at level 2, I'm at level 3 and 4. Well, what happens if you're at 100 billion? Okay, there's no way of differing between them, because the size ratio, if it's all proportional, if it's all not proportional but relative, because you're in a cosmic, innerverse, okay, then you use the proportions, and you can literally say I'm on level 13, 8, 5, whatever, and you know where you're at in the overall, because then, again, imagine you go to level a billion using these proportional patterns, not using the layers of just floor 1, floor 2, but these proportions. Then you get another pattern from there, and you can organize yourself within the larger view. That's the whole point. That's what I'm trying to make sense of here. And as well, I have some of the typed ideas. And so the the fractal iterations generates the ultimate cosmic pattern, which is the one you want to zoom out and see. That's basically the Buddha brought fractal pattern, where all the layers add up to creating the overall picture. And so then there's a slow increase, and then a peak experience, and exponential growth, and then a singularity. It is literally like this one. It is just like this one image that I'll find real quick. Okay, so basically you zoomed out so much that you end up with this pattern. The idea is, when you get to the overall pattern, it's not a number set. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's not a kind of, map of the universe, if you will. It's a map of your experience in coming to the overall awareness of what you are in relation to what is out there and what has happened. It's experience. You create an exponential curve, if you will, a shift in processing of information awareness, and it basically hits that curve, and every time you reach that end point, what you ended up creating is a cosmic journey, a hero's journey, or whatever you want. There's many names for this, and you create a cosmic storyline, basically. I can't think of the word right now. It's like a cosmic saga. And that's the path of getting out, that you create one of these sagas and you overcome all the resistance that holds you in, because it's your own, attention being given to those resistors that enables you to be held back. And so it's in overcoming that we make a path out, as well as this kind of geometric, literal, mathematical, energetic pattern that is created or realized. And usually it makes this exponential curve, and the way we experience that is something like this, where it's kind of, you go up and you're ready to go, and then you get set back a little bit, and you get across another plateau, and there's a set series of plateaus until you basically hit an ultimate breakaway speed, if you will, a breakaway velocity. And then there's a peak experience, which is coming to the awareness of all that is, and then you hit your singularity, and the other side of that singularity is literally what is called the real, or what is the universe outside of the system. And so the speed is the acceleration of your awareness beyond your consciousness, and this is like the velocity increase of the rate of increase of the velocity increase. So it's rate of increase squared, if you will. And that would literally look like something increasing here, and then you have a number set of that's going up to another degree, and then you have it increasing faster, and so then you have each number here is now being multiplied by a number set that's down here, and then you have another one. And what happens is the amount of numbers going this way and the amount of numbers being multiplied against those numbers going this way, the layers of multiplication, when you get to here, they go out into infinity. I can't see my hands. They go out into infinity both ways. That means this central processing system, whatever we're in, can't track you anymore. It doesn't work anymore. You go beyond the phi ratio, beyond what it can compute for your consciousness, and that's when your awareness goes beyond your consciousness. But you have to actually energetically walk yourself there by tracing those that map. You create that map, if you will, and you have that key in the corner where this is where I started, this is where I'm ending up, and these are the proportions that follow, and you go beyond basically the pattern that is being presented to you. You keep going within, because I'll have to explain the rest of that in another video, because it's a type of, and that is what the other end of this video it talks about, but I'm leaving that for another one because it's kind of stretched this one out too far. But that acceleration happens because there is a resistance. It's as if the universe continues to recreate itself around you every way you go, so you have to begin to do that. You realize the phi ratio faster than you're basically experiencing it, because that is what's literally being morphed in and created around you as the universe attempts to keep you within itself, and it kind of, it's like rolling inside out, if you will. As soon as you get to the outside, it kind of pops back from being behind you and folds around you, and so you have to continue to expand on all angles, and there's a pattern for that. You can't just make a line and go draw on. That's not fast enough. It's not expanding in all dimensions, all directions, and so you become intimate of you become aware of these patterns, and in doing so, you know how to multiply and expand them, and then you can mirror them, and then eventually, when you apply all the techniques, it goes faster than the phi ratio can recreate itself for it to cage your consciousness, and your awareness actually escapes your consciousness. You create an escape velocity for your consciousness, and so it's as if the rate of velocity is in the velocity increase. The rate of velocity is or increasing velocity is squared, then cubed, and so on until a peak acceleration is reached that goes beyond the body or the physical universe's ability to compress and contain the format or the rates of experience and information, and thus the person's awareness. The awareness then rockets or shoots like lightning across the dimensional barrier, essentially opening up a doorway. So first, the shape that you're in, that you're aware of through your energies, your inner self, the higher self, lower, the true compassion, power, the principles of how you operate, they have to be harmonized. That way, there is no imbalance, because you can't mirror a sloppy oval circle and end up with a complete fractal pattern. Excuse me, not fractal. But you can't end up with a pattern overall that's harmonized if the small cycle within is not harmonized. So that's literally the now moment. You balance your energy, your presence within the now moment. In other words, you look down on the disc in the other video and look to the center. Or if you have the toroid, in this video I described, instead of looking out and it's kind of elongated and like a magnifying glass is pulling the edges out, you focus and go straight down, so you have the center point as your center of focus, and the universe centers around that because it's based upon your observation. So you do that in the now moment, and then you do that each layer by layer, tracing up, making note of where you're going, and you increase the rate of acceleration beyond the rate of acceleration that you began at. It's kind of confusing, but I'll work on this in another video. It's proportions. You notice the proportions from one layer to the next and accelerate beyond those proportions. But again, it recreates those portions based upon your consciousness and awareness of them. So you have to go faster than your awareness. It's basically going faster and faster and faster continuously until you go faster than all numbers can actually represent. And then you're gone out of the physical limitation system, if you will. And so the singularity singularity, or excuse me. So, and then the state you're in must be harmonized, the present, if you will, must be harmonized and balanced. Then the acceleration pattern must be reached, and this is that lady Rosa Tex. I think the gist of it is, and I was talking about that as well. They showed me, I met those people. Okay, they were telling me that this is how it works. I've already done this, but they were telling me like we're here to help you, and we're here to help the others. Basically, they can offer a beam, an energy that accelerates your expansion out. They can help pull you out, but you must remain centered and harmonized. Otherwise, you'll flop out and spin out like a something you stretching out and ripping open or something energetically, and that doesn't amount in consciousness at the end of that, or not consciousness. You're leaving that behind. It doesn't amount in overall awareness at the end of that. But they can actually accelerate and help increase the energy and basically draw people out of this like black goo, if you will, holographic, ultra dense space hologram simulator fluid thing that we're in. We're stuck in it like a ballistics gel. How it looks when the bullet goes in a ballistics gel and there's a line out. Well, that's what happens when a person builds up that energy and shoots out. They literally crack out of the dimension. And so the balance must be created in the center, in the present. Okay, you get that centeredness, that centered awareness in the present moment, not off in time, not some other way of doing it, but in the now. And then a acceleration pattern must be reached, which is where you basically begin to contract and expand in proportion, slow, and then accelerated until you hit that singularity. Okay, you do that until it goes beyond numbers, and then the intensity is threefold. The intensity of presence must be maintained so that only the self remains to continue the acceleration into the exponential shift, which would otherwise destroy all that is attached, that is actually the shadow layer of the lower dimension of the universe, the lower, basically, physical dimension. So if your ego, if your worries, if you have fear, if all that is caught up in this, then it throws the whole process off. So you have to let all of that go and stand firm in your presence. It'll get thrown off anyway, but it's just more frightening when you're holding on to these things and you're watching them rip out and turn into, holographic dust, if you will. And as well, fear is part of the system. I described that before, that if on the outside, the other end, we're all in a way, mirrors of ourselves. Okay, living now like we're jokers and it's not serious and you can just hurt people or whatever you want, in that way, that's going to make, so when you get to that overall picture, it's not going to make sense. Fear is the same thing. On the other end, there's no fear. Why would you have fear? So if we have fear now and we're holding on to it, we're not being ourselves. We're not being the true creator that we are on the other side of that singularity, and we're not honestly knowing what we're doing here and now. Because, and also, these are tools, because if you have a fear, okay, something like that, well, guess what? If you feel like you're not the creator, well, go face your fear. You can go knock on that fear's door. Not a person. I'm just making a metaphor here. Don't like go punch somebody in the face at their door or something crazy like that. But you go knock on the fear's door and say, I want to talk to you right now, and you confront it. Instantly, that's an instant path to knowing yourself as the creator. It's a booster. That's how it works. But if you don't do that and you allow it to crunch you down, then it literally is like black oil or goo, and it sucks person's energy. So when those three patterns are created, those these steps, if you will, are created, more so achieved, and again, we're creating that pattern as we do it. It's literally like we invent it as we do it. Then the singularity is reached, and the other side is what is known as the real. And so remember, this is not done through space. We don't fly in a rocket ship together. It's not possible. It would just recreate itself like the cycling of the torus. This is an acceleration of awareness into what has been termed 0-point space, and this is a fractal pattern. But if this is used as the fractal pattern without the beginning or end, then it becomes an endless maze. It is the false light, the rabbit hole, if you will, and it does not stop, and it equals a cycling energy plant, if you will. So this uses the transition of energy of that awareness to literally convert the awareness of the person, their presence, their non-physical presence, into a kind of gateway system, a Jacob's ladder system, if you will, out of the realm. And the idea is it's not fractal layer after fractal and so many numbers that it all goes and there's nothing there because it's a billion, and a billion is the same as whatever because it's really the portions between it. It's that this is one motion, one shift, one time, one moment. It's all one. The whole thing adds up to one. When you add up all the layers, you get one. You don't get a billion, you don't get a trillion, you don't get 50, you don't get 33, you don't get 18, 9, 6, whatever, you get 1. And there may be, 3, 6, 9 about that within there. And any more than that generally is confusing and kind of more of a part of the construct. Although it's expanse, but it's going to relate to the construct if you start breaking it down more than that, because it's very centralized and basic. And so it's one moment in motion and shift and all that covers the expanse of all the information, the distance, the energy, the space, and the time of the entire physical universe and goes beyond. And that's the whole point of that the whole idea goes beyond everything that you have access to within the physical body across your entire physical life and the entire physical universe and all the history of humanity. We have access to beyond that because we can imagine it, simply put. And I didn't say this before. I guess I forgot. Maybe I'll add it in. But that, well, I guess this is still recording, so, where is this? There. So basically, this is kind of interesting. But this is the original Matrix movie. That's it. These are Neos getting out. I mean, there's a whole thing about neocortex, and it being an illusion and stuff like that. You know what I mean. These are people getting out, if you will, of the Matrix. These are, this guy, that's Morpheus. These are people they didn't have in this Matrix Hyperboreans that weren't, they didn't include that in the movies. They didn't include in the movies people that actually made it out and come from the realm that never had a matrix. And I'm just like, oh, you need some help. They didn't have that in the movie. They just had like Zion and stuff like that. These are the agents, okay? These are the guys that are like, you know, you need to stay. Screw that. Come with us. And it's really desire holding them back. The attention to the world and the pains of the world. They think that they are the people that are getting knocked off. They're not, because they don't even exist at this point. It's just a continuous, this is the only thing that's actually ever happening is we're getting out. Everything else is just an illusion. It's just weird how it works, but that's what it is. And so these are the original matrices. I kind of found that interesting, funny. And so then this is the idea of the some of these societies, secret societies, excuse me, I'm talking fast here. They spent many hours trying to figure out how to best describe all this, but this is their idea of making it a little bit more meaningful. It's not a ladder, you don't got to go to work to do it. Although that in itself might be a kind of a trap, you will. And so that's the basic idea behind that. I don't know if people are going to get it early. I'm going to have to do it again anyway, but then I have one more portion of this video to do and I'll be done. So I actually deleted that file I just did right after I made it, so I had to redo the whole thing. It's kind of, I was kind of a little bit out of the ordinary, disjointed. I also got a different viewpoint way to explain this, a little bit easier. So you have here the Fibonacci numbers and waveforms elongated out, and there's actually another name for it. And so the idea is, if you could just do these iterations, if you will, from, you know, 2 here to 2 there, and so there's 4 in all, and then it keeps going, you literally can go forever. How do you have a beginning or end? The idea is, if you can go forever, well, what you'll end up with is proportions between one layer to the next. If you have proportions between them, then eventually you'll have a repeating pattern, okay, a ratio of proportions to the next, and it'll go on and on and on. The idea is, if you can just collapse the numbers down, like they fold evenly within one another, like evens, okay, maybe even primes, then you really don't have that many numbers. You just have a specific set of, say, 1 to 6, or literally 1, 3, 6, 9, and those ratios, those patterns, that pattern is simply repeating over and over and over endlessly. That's what continues. In actuality, you only have one set of ratios, or one ratio, which goes from 1, 3, 6, and 9. And that's it. There's literally just 1, 2 here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and it keeps going down and down and down. But that's a, you know, that's a 1 to 2 pattern. When you get objects in the universe and mathematics that basically describes our being, our consciousness, and the maximal limits you can get, you get a similar pattern that develops, a ratio, but that pattern, everything fits into that pattern. You can't go outside of it. So it doesn't mean that it goes forever and ever into limitless fractal infinity. It means that those patterns are actually just repeating themselves. It's just the same thing. If you play a movie over and over again twice, you know, however many times, is it a new movie? No. I mean, technically you can say because you view it differently each time because the way brain consciousness works, but that's not the point. The point is that just because it repeats, if it's the same information, the same numbers, okay, it's the same value. Nothing is created new. So in essence, there isn't 1,000 layers, 1 billion this way, 100,000 that way. It's literally just 3 or 6 or 9 or whatever they're going to collapse down into. And those basic numbers, the original numbers, basically the cosmic family, those are the principles that all existence comes from. It's all awareness, all experience. That's what a human is created out of. And so in knowing those principles and mapping our own existence out to that, we can attain them. And in realizing that, we don't get lost in endless number patterns or fractal layers or repeating ourselves endlessly. We can literally organize ourselves by knowing exactly how many layers there are in all, and all we have to do then is zoom out a maximum of that layer of numbers, that number of layers, excuse me, like 9 layers, or, you know, whatever. There's theories that it's 9 is basically how the 3, 6, and 9 collapse, and all numbers, you basically can't have a number more than 9 because all numbers collapse down into that, all the wholeness basically, and if it's not whole, it's not really doing what it is. And anyway, so that would mean that everything, say you have a number larger than that, many layers, okay, well you could find a way to organize those fractal layers into one another, so in actuality there's only 9. And in doing that, once you can do that with all the experience, all the fractal layers, the timelines, the universe, whatever it is, you end up with a complete picture of the whole universe, and once you know that pattern, you can use that to accelerate from one end to the other and get out the other end once you hit escape velocity. That's the whole point. It's a map to basically escape the universe. And the idea is that if we're in a simulation that's based upon our self-observation or our aware consciousness, okay, then we have to become aware faster than our consciousness is being used to generate the simulation. We have to think, if you will, the simulation. And it's really become more aware, because you can't outthink it. That's the whole point. We use it to think. It mimics us in that sense. So we have to move intellectually, if you will, but more so just pure awareness, faster than the simulation. So this is the last segment here. And so the kind of got to the idea that the tree here, this overall pattern, in order to make sense of the endlessly repeating layers, you have to develop a notion of the proportions and develop a form of basically math or numerology from that proportions, which you can then determine what is just a repeating pattern and what the base, fundamental order of those patterns are. And from there you can map yourself out, or at least the larger universe. And so this is the Sierpinski, I believe, fractal repeating triangular pattern, and this loops actually, but it's not doing that. I like how the software doesn't. Alright, so imagine it just keeps doing that. And so basically with the triangle you have 3, and everything kind of comes down to that. It's the initial shape, if you will. And so then the idea is that we have past, present, and future. And so to kind of jump forward, time is basically the fractal infection. Time is the holographic labyrinth, the maze. It is the cage that we're in. And so there is no time within the illusion, because it's all relative and illusory. All there is to define the length one spends in this simulation or universe, whatever you want to call it, is the amount of energy required to organize the proportions of movement to create a pathway out, which is dependent on the individual. It's basically how you construct your hero's journey, that exponential curve. That's the amount of time you spend in here. It could be, it's all relative, basically, and it's usually basically all it equals it's hard to describe it, what it feels like. So the pathway would be seeing the whole, and this is basically through maximizing the universe's ability to recreate those fractal repeating loops by becoming more aware than the scope of the limitation of the viewing apparatus, basically the brain and the interplay, the feedback interplay of the universe, of those fractal layers, by knowing the proportions in one's awareness instead of relying on that viewing apparatus or looking glass of the mind or biological consciousness in order to determine, because that's just going to feed back into that feedback loop and recreate the problem, more or less. So eventually you get enough knowledge where you just know, and in knowing you don't have to basically think and process. It's kind of like if it's a spiral staircase, and we'll imagine this is with a spiral staircase, then on each stair, going both horizontally as well as vertically, is kind of like if you had that pattern and that pattern all in one. Okay, so there's a way to realize that, and basically that is spread out through the phi ratio. So once you get phi ratio, you can count a certain amount, and you get that ultimate segment, and then you can zoom in and out from there in order to find out basically where you are in relation to the other layers. And so, and it's also, imagine if you're kind of looking at the layers like this, to the point where they can extend horizontally and also vertically. So we kind of, we have to organize within both of those dimensions in order to realize where we are at. And that's kind of like the spiral staircase going up, but it also has a spiral staircase going out and around in a way. They're like spiraling stairs. And so you must organize within your mind a complete linear representation of such a pattern, that ratio, that contains all the information of the entire universe from the beginning step. The important part is from the beginning to the end, and not just somewhere in the middle, or 2 or 3 or whatever it is. You have to, from the moment you begin that journey to the completion point, you have to hold that awareness in your mind and visualize that. Otherwise it's going to loop back around and you basically won't realize it. And so when that's done, you traverse the pattern with your awareness. Your awareness moves faster and contains more information than the entire pattern or universe can contain, and you're more or less ejected from the computer system or the mainframe, which seeks to contain all things. So if it's a spiral staircase, you have to reach the top floor while keeping memory of the arrangement of the first step in your mind, or another way of seeing it is while keeping your left foot on the bottom step and making it to the top step with your right foot. All that doesn't really make sense physically, but it's the idea. You have to be throughout the whole thing. So you advance your awareness faster and more than the simulation can compute and hold you within. In other words, if we're in one of those shapes, those mandalas or geometric toroids, and every motion recreates another version of that shape directly in front of us, then how do we exit the shape or the construct? The keeping of the memory of the original layer to the external is like creating a picture in your mind, making your own simulation. And so then that acts as a map and a key, and the key to the map is literally using that map in your mind to ascend out of the system while also being the character on the map. And so the idea is you're the character on the map, but you're also the person on the outside of the map, basically reading from that map key, meaning you're literally watching yourself from above, if you will, and through this simultaneous superimposition of yourself in both places through the knowledge of creating that map, because remember, the system is making the universe around you from what you create within. In doing that, you basically, you create a transverse exit plane that converges the outside with the inside, and you make an exit way, make a streamline out. And so if you can zoom, it's as if you can zoom out to see all the layers while holding onto the first layer, because if you let it go, it'll kind of slingshot towards you, and then the universe recreates a new computational set, and the whole process has to start all over if you actually want to go somewhere. And the going nowhere idea is pretty much fully represented here, where it just continues. And that's much better when it repeats, but I'll have to figure that out. Oops. So on the website, obviously, it's better. That repeats endlessly, and it just, you keep zooming into this area. If you see, this is the same as this, and so the whole process just keeps repeating, and that's also the same as that, and it goes into the center. It's basically a mirror, a reflection. And so that's the loop, that no one ever actually goes anywhere if they're following that fractal grid. It's like an ascending tone. You could think you are, you could think you're feeling and hearing it or perceiving it, but it's not. It's the same thing over and over again. It's the same as this being a person, okay, going from a body to a larger being, then you wake up and you're in a body again, and the whole process just keeps going. That's the trap system that was invented. And so you create your pathway out through visualization, centering, harmonization, and simultaneous expansion and contraction faster than the universe can reposition you in a new layer separated from the others. By holding that memory, it can't become a divided, separated system where it makes you think that that's basically the whole picture. It's kind of like remembering across the barriers. Your awareness can move faster than the physical limits. It doesn't have a physical counterpart. It doesn't require one. It is through the organizational pattern of the specific geometries that enable the presence of self beyond the physical, which actually open up the capacity for faster than light travel of awareness. Since the numbers repeat and continue to collapse endlessly, there is only actually one ratio, and that ratio is the limitation of values for the expression of self in this universe, and therefore you are beyond that limit. The movements of those fractals, okay, they're more or less mesmerizing, and that's the point. It's literally like a snake's shaking its tail to distract its prey, or to, in this way, inadvertently warn a more intelligent being. So all the geometry that we know of is literally part of the holographic universal containment system. That's why we know of it. We would have to be like the hypercube and use programming, the one I described in the early part of the video, and use programming that goes beyond the confines of the physical dimension in order to comprehend the truth, although this could still fall within the illusion. The outcome is basically don't get stuck doing the same thing over and over again, be creative, and continue on this overall journey. And so, as well, there's another aspect to this. And so the other aspect is that if the barriers of the geometric cube, or wherever we're at, if the barriers are reflections, more or less, okay, then what we do when approaching these barriers is going to reflect back at us. So if we're attempting to get out of this realm through domination, we're going to be met with somebody attempting to get out through us with domination, and we'll reflect that back to us, basically. So, then it's interesting, because then the only action that would allow us to basically cross over that barrier would literally be a non-dual action that does not incorporate polarized intentions or perspectives in the self, basically, the perspective that it's coming forth from. The only way to pass through that barrier would literally be to have no self, to have no adherence to the illusory qualities of the self that belong only to this universe. In doing that, one could pass right through the barriers. And that's kind of weird, because it's kind of like it's a containment system for people who don't know, more or less, the cosmic truth. And it's weird in that sense. It's kind of like a game. But I do believe the game kind of got out of hand because people figured that out and kind of made the decision to keep everyone down. And in that aspect, those that basically think they're going to do that and get out, they're going to do that and get to the barrier and get slapped back by another version of themselves that's doing the same thing to them. And those who basically, offer transcendence will get to the barrier and receive transcendence and move right through it, or receive a helping hand out. So the idea behind that, the main idea here, is that time is the fractal infection, if you will.